Okay, welcome to lesson 3, and this is the second half for week 3, American Revolution. We are looking at the time from 1777 into 1780, right? And a little bit into 1781, just into January. And so 3 main ideas that we're looking at with this lesson are the French alliance, the importance of the French alliance, the Battle of Vincennes, the Western battles, the Ohio River Valley, and their Southern campaign. A few people we're going to look at today: George Washington, Francis Marion, George Clark. Also, I'm going to touch on the role of Native Americans and enslaved Africans in the colonies. So again, we start with the battles of Lexington and Concord back in 1775. And then we're moving forward. By the time we get to 1777, George Washington has been very successful. He has attacked the Hessians in Trenton. He's gone to attack British troops in Princeton, New Jersey, both with wins. Basically a comeback from the disaster at the Battle of Brooklyn, where he had to retreat. And so what is the next turning point that we see in the American Revolution? These wins in New Jersey that George Washington has really pick up the morale and the attention of the people in the colonies. Remember, if you're living in the colonies, you have basically 3 choices. You could side with the colonists who are rebelling. You can side with the British government and British king, or you can try to be neutral, which is going to be increasingly difficult as the war goes on. So what we're going to look at here is the first battle that's a major turning point, and that is going to be the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. That happens in the fall of 1777. This battle actually takes place over a few different weeks. There's an attack, there's a retreat, there's attack again. You can study this battle in quite good detail. Any of these battles that I talk about, there are national parks associated with them in the United States. And so if you look up the National Park Service and then you look up like Saratoga National Park Service, you can look for George Clark. And if you type these people in, you'll get a lot of information on them. There's also Mount Vernon, which has a lot of information about George Washington, but not just him as a person, but also the battles that he was part of and how he commanded the army during the Revolution. So what we're looking at is, we know that the Patriots have control of Boston Harbor, but the British maintain and will, for the duration of the war, keep control of New York City. We also know that the British are going to have the upper part, which is now Canada, that they took from the French in the French and Indian War in 1764. So this British surrender at Saratoga, New York is very eventful because it's an actual surrender. Remember, the Battle of Brooklyn was a win for the British, but there was no surrender. George Washington retreated the troops. He didn't actually surrender the troops, because when a surrendering is happening, you're going to surrender the troops as prisoners of war. You are going to surrender all of your equipment, your food, everything that you have, your horses, your tents, everything that has maintained your army is also surrendered. And so with a surrender, you're not just saying, I quit, you win, but you're giving your enemy a big advantage. Now, what's interesting here is, and in the middle, this is not George Washington that we see in this painting, but in the middle we see General Gates. And General Gates is a very good commander. He also fought in the French and Indian War, as did George Washington, as did many of the leaders that we see along and among the Continental Army. Even some of the local militia will be people that have fought on the side of the British against the French in the last major war, which is the French and Indian War. And so here we have General Gates, and something he does here, you see that the British general has a sword, and he's getting ready to hand it over. In a surrender, traditionally, you hand over the sword. That's surrendering your, basically, your position. And what General Gates does is he invites the British general into his tent. You see the tent with the American flag over it, the Continental flag, and he invites him in. They sit down. They have a rather cordial discussion. They sign the paperwork of a surrender. And then he returns the sword back to him, showing him that he has respect for them. He is not going to treat him harshly. The soldiers will still be maintained as prisoners, though. So Saratoga is a huge, huge win. And it's such a win if we look at the numbers, right? Here we have 22,000 soldiers were fighting in this battle. So when I say a battle, we're not talking about 5 or 10 people fighting. It can be from hundreds. It can be up into the tens of thousands. If you see here that it was about twice as many American soldiers as there were British, and the British casualties are about 3 to 1, which is what prompted the surrender. So casualties are a combination of those killed and wounded. So you'd have to look deeper to find out how many soldiers actually lost their lives in this battle and how many were merely wounded. All right, so the next major turning point that we're going to look at, we're going to come back to the importance of Saratoga in a moment. The next major one that we're going to look at isn't even a battle, but it's a turning point. And what we're going to look at is the winter of 1777 into the spring of 1778. Okay, and so Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, very cold, brutal winter, but this was typical of how wars were fought during this time, that both sides would take a winter break, and they would, some soldiers would go home for winter, some would camp out, but they would regroup, rest the troops, bring in extra supplies. And winters are generally hard to move things around in, because remember, this is the time of horse and wagons. And so if it's freezing and then it thaws, you have mud. And then if you're trying to move through the mud, it's just near impossible. Fighting's not efficient on either side. Not to mention, it's harder to get foods. This is before the time of canning. Canning has not been invented yet. So you have to eat what's available at that moment, unless it's salted or dried. So this is a map that shows you where we are when we're talking about Valley Forge. And Valley Forge is on the Schuylkill River. It is a few miles outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia now being the capital of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is a very big city. It's going to become the second largest city in the United States once the United States are formed in the 1780s. Big metropolis, huge metropolis of people, a good mixture of people. But why this area? So the British are holding New York City and they're holding Philadelphia. And this is a good central location. You're not so far north that you're 1,500 miles away, 3,000 kilometers away from Charleston, South Carolina. This is a good midpoint. And so George Washington decides to camp a few miles outside of where the British are. There's a few advantages to this. If the British were to try to attack, you're far enough away that you have advance notice, because you're going to have people, outliers, who are going to be watching the movements of your enemy. You also, this is a very heavily forested area. It has a deep valley. You see the river that goes through, so you have fresh water. Again, the forest lands for building huts, for wood, for heat, and hopefully for game. There's also a stone house in the area that George Washington's going to commandeer and use as his headquarters. So it's a good location overall. So here's a photo of some reenactors at Valley Forge in the National Park. And if you notice that these are huts that are more like little, not even cottages. They're one room, and you can fit between 4 to 8 people in a room. It's going to be very tight quarters. They have a dirt floor, have a door, and they do have, you see the chimneys on them. The people at the National Park, when I visited, told me that it stays between 40 and 50 degrees during the winter time, with the people's body heat and the thickness of the timber that they have in the huts, that it's going to stay above freezing. It's not going to be comfortable. It's still going to be damp, but it will stay above freezing inside there with the people in there. And then if you can have a small fire going, that's fine too. They also are going to have big clay stoves that they're going to use for baking bread. You see in this photo that there's women there. And there were a lot of women who followed their husbands into battle. Some we're going to talk about later even become part of the battle. But mostly the women were going to be behind the scenes. They were going to be behind the scenes nursing the wounded. They were going to be the seamstresses caring for the uniforms. They were going to be helping with the food. They were going to be helping preparing the area, even not really gardening in this area, but doing what had to be done behind the scenes so that the soldiers would be able to fight. And if you were at Valley Forge, you're going to hear a mix of languages. These are people who have come to join the Continental Army from all of the colonies. So you're going to have Scottish, Irish, Dutch, Swedish, just a myriad of languages and a myriad of people. You're going to have officers and officers' families. Even some children are going to be there. There's going to be some entertainment. The camp's going to get together, and the women of the camp are going to put on a little skit. And, not all of the wives and families stay for the entire winter. Some come for a week. Some come more towards springtime. Some come more towards the Christmas holiday. And it really depends. You're going to have a lot of people coming and a lot of people going. There's going to be Native Americans coming in the camp. They're going to be camped a little bit separately, but they will be there. You're going to have enslaved people. George Washington had slaves that he brought with him from Mount Vernon, especially a well-known pastry chef. Also his housekeeper and most of his household staff were enslaved people that he brought with him. You're going to have free blacks that are also part of the army. So again, a really good mix of people at Valley Forge. But that's not what makes Valley Forge a turning point. What makes Valley Forge a turning point, and aside from my dog barking, what makes Valley Forge important is the training that happened at Valley Forge. So what we see here is this gentleman with the long row of buttons going down his boots and a red vest. Off to the far right, he is von Steuben, General von Steuben. And he comes over from Europe. He comes over from Prussia. And he has heard through Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who have really been working in Europe trying to get assistance for support for the Continental Army. And he comes with a reference letter from Benjamin Franklin and volunteers to serve. And he says, just pay me at the end. When the war's over and you win, you can pay me. He's going to be fed during that time and have his uniforms and a horse. And so what we see here is von Steuben is drilling them. He's pointing and he's saying, this is what you do. And you notice that these men do not look very orderly. So the type of fighting that you would do at this time is the front row would drop to their knee, they would raise their guns, they would aim. At the same time, you see the men behind them, they're preparing theirs, and so then they're going to be able to shoot back over, and they're going to rotate around. The men in the front will pull around to the back, and then you're going to keep advancing your line that way and moving. And von Steuben did such an excellent job of training that even into the late 1800s, his handbook and manual for training for the U.S. Army is what was used, the Blue Book of Training. So von Steuben is remarkable for the training that he accomplished at Valley Forge, but he had a legacy that was left within what became the United States Army. So they're getting well trained. In addition to that, there's a smallpox breakout of a terrible virus. Now, this doesn't bother the British soldiers too much because many of them were vaccinated in England or had been exposed to it. In the American colonies, smallpox had not been that rampant. The very first settlers who were coming over in the 1600s and 1700s either had it or had been exposed to it, and the later generations that come over are going to have exposure to it. But many of the people in the Continental Army were native to the colonies. They had been born in North America and did not have prior exposure to smallpox. And if this runs through a community, it would kill a community, is what happened to many of the Native Americans in North America. And so George Washington writes an order that all men in all of the Continental Army camps, this was just one of the winter camps, will be inoculated for smallpox unless there's evidence that they've had it before. And at that time, getting a vaccination wasn't quite as simple as it is today, and people usually took a little bit longer to recover from one. But having the vaccination, having the recovery time really helped to strengthen the Army. And many historians see that as a major decision that led to the winning of the Continental troops. They probably would have been wiped out with a smallpox epidemic had that not happened. Now, the other reason we're looking at this image is because it does a good job of depicting what it was like. It was hard. The men did have huts, but you also had to go find kindling. You see, you don't have huge logs that they're burning. They are not well dressed. Some are recovering from battle wounds. They don't have heavy winter coats. Many of the men didn't have shoes. If they had shoes, their boots had holes in them. They had been walking for miles. And so part of what George Washington does, and it's partly Alexander Hamilton and some other people working with George Washington, that they write to the members of Congress. They say, you need to come here yourself. You need to tour my encampment. You need to see what these men are going through. You need to see our conditions. We need money. We need supplies. And it's this working together with them, but especially making the members of Congress come see for themselves what the soldiers were going through. Helps to bring some supplies in, but it's still very hard. And there's some people working behind the scenes that work very hard to make sure that the men are hopefully getting the food that they need. Because this many men, you have a couple thousand people in a camp. You can't just go into the woods every day to be able to feed them. You have to be able to get supplies coming into you, which is hard because it's winter, and it's hard because there is a war going on. Even if people are resting in their camps, they're still trying to sabotage each other. All right. And the other thing that happens is the French, upon hearing of the success at the Battle of Saratoga back in October of 1777, word arrives in February that the French have agreed to support the Continental Congress and therefore the Continental Army against the British. And that support means that they will send money, they will send ships, they will send soldiers, they will sell gunpowder and rifles and uniforms and boots, all of the supplies that they need. So this is fantastic news. This is the best news because you have to fight with money. Wars cost money. And the Continental Congress only came about because of grievances against taxes, because of the battles at Lexington and Concord. These were not people who had a huge stockpile of money coming into the battle. And so they need the support. This is critical. And so all of those things come together. So by the time we're looking at the spring, early summer in 1778, this is the best fighting force that the Continental Army has had. They're going to be better prepared, and not only prepared individually, but as an army altogether, they're going to be better prepared. Okay, so these are some major turning points, and all for different reasons. So let's look westward in an area that's actually not the colonies. And lots of times it's not spoken about when talking about the American Revolution, but it's very important because it's looking at, again, supplies. It's looking at morale, because people are going to hear about the wins. They're going to hear about the losses, and you need the public supporting you, whichever side you are. And so we're going to look at George Clark, and this is not George Clark this is part of the image from Delaware, Washington crossing the Delaware. But this is an example of what the men would be wearing who were over on this part in the westward lands. And you see where I have it circled in red. This is the area that we're talking about. This is what was known as Indian land at the time. So following the French and Indian War in 1764, the British government determined that all of the land that's that orange color would be known as Indian land. This was land that the colonists were forbidden from entering. And this was land that the Native Americans that had been pushed off their land by the colonists on the East Coast could have a place that they could live peacefully. So this land is going to come into issue because there's going to be quite a few British forts along there. And the British are supplying Native Americans to attack colonial towns in the name of the British. And so when word gets to the Iroquois Confederacy that there is going to be a battle, as the colonists said, a battle with our father, King George, that the Confederacy said, we want no trouble upon the waters, and the waters being the Ohio River. You can see it, the Ohio River is what goes right across above where it says Virginia. No trouble across these waters, which is the very area that the French and Indian War was fought over. Okay. And so the British really didn't think that anyone would come get them on this side. They say we have the Native Americans to the west of the colonies along the Ohio River who are willing to fight for the British. And Detroit, Fort Detroit, which is way up north in what's now Michigan, is where all the supplies were coming in from Canada, because the British control Canada at this point. And again, Native Americans are repeating, we will not suffer an army to march through our country. In other words, if you march your battle through our land, we will choose sides. They didn't want to choose sides. They just wanted to exist. They have already been through enough loss and coming and going. And so what we see is where George Clark's route was. Okay. He starts in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the west in the Allegheny Mountains. And then he travels all along the Ohio River, the very river he should not go west of. And then he starts taking towns. And he's traveling with a group of about 200 men. You see where he is, and he's in St. Louis, Missouri. He's going to go into Vincennes, Indiana. And that's where we're going to talk about what happens there. He takes a major fort, which was a major hub for distribution of supplies. And so who is he going against? He's going against British Henry Hamilton. All right, this is in 1779. So Clark is interesting. This one battle is what we'll discuss. He was in many in that Ohio River Valley. But as he's attacking the fort where Hamilton is, he only has about 200 men, less than 200 men. Now, at this point in time, if you were fighting, you're going to have a flag. A flag might represent, let's say, 100 men. Clark has an idea, though. He unfurls, which means to open and let fly, about 5 flags, which would typically represent about 500 soldiers. And so as the British soldiers in the fort are looking out through the towers, and they see these flags coming across the hillside, and they make the assumption that it's a very large unit of soldiers coming for them. And so they know that they're going to be outnumbered. They cannot fight against that many men. And they surrender. Now, they were probably wise to surrender for 2 reasons. One, Clark, as he surrounds the fort, starts some people digging tunnels to actually go under the walls of the fort and go into the middle. So Clark was dead set on winning. And we're going to talk about, he is probably not a military leader to follow as far as doing what's right, but he did get the job done. His troops were marksmen. They were hunters. These were men from the long-range hunters, someone like Daniel Boone, who would go off into the woods and hunt for months at a time and then come back. These were not farmhands who occasionally went out to shoot game to feed their family. These were people who shot game for a living to get the skins, the deer skins and such. And again, because Hamilton thinks he's surrounded, he surrenders. Right. And so what was important about this fort is that the Fort Detroit fed into Vincennes. And Fort Detroit is where everything came into, all the supplies came in. And these were supplies that were helping the Native Americans who chose to side with the British. And so by taking this Fort Vincennes in Indiana, you stop part of that supply line. You start not only supplying the British soldiers, but also the Native Americans who were working with them. Now, I do have to talk about Clark unnecessarily, and I use the word execute because it was a brutal death. These men had done nothing wrong. They had not attacked him. If you are surrendering, again, you are taken as a prisoner of war, but you are not killed when you surrender. That's the understanding. But he kills 5 Delaware and Ottawas who are coming in from a raiding party. And so what the Native Americans were asked to do is they were supplied with gunpowder and guns, and they were told to go raid towns who supported the Continental Army, and thereby basically making people scared, by making people afraid to choose to support the Continental Army, and hoping that they could change the morale. What Clark does, though, is it really turns the Native Americans against the British. Word quickly spreads through the Iroquois Confederacy and other Native American nations that the British could not defend them and would not defend them because the British stood by while this happened. And so this is the equivalent of what happened at Bunker Hill, that it's how people perceive the battle, how people perceive what happened, that really is a turning point. And just to address the fact that about 13,000 American Native warriors representing several of the nations along the colonies did choose to fight for the British. And you have some that chose to fight with the Continentals. They trusted the British more. They felt that the British king, because in their mind's eye, he was a king of a great and vast nation. He would be a fair leader, and he would be more likely to keep true to what he said. The Native Americans had lived among the colonies for the last 200 years, 150 years, and they could see that the colonists did not keep their word. Every time a treaty was made between Native Americans and the colonists, it would be broken, and the Native Americans would be pushed off their land. And so they came to not trust the colonists. And that's one of the reasons that they sided with the British. All right, so here we have a couple of stamps. We have one with George Clark taking over the fort. And then here we have one stamp. And the reason I have this is showing the type of men as they march. And you see they've got flag there. These are woodsmen. These are huntsmen. So right after this battle, or the summer after this battle, we have the French warships finally arrive. So while money starts coming to the Continental Congress and uniforms and such are coming across the Atlantic, it takes quite a while for the warships to be prepared, to be outfitted, for the soldiers to be trained and ready. And they finally arrive in Rhode Island and New York. And the first joint battle they're going to have is outside Providence, Rhode Island. And these are huge warships for the time. And so they bring the battle out into the ocean. Well, Mother Nature has a difference of opinion about this battle. And so not only do you have cannons flying one ship to the other, but you have a hurricane that descends upon this battle. And so both sides are terribly battle-worn. Their ships are damaged. And the French ships, right after arriving, have to go into Boston Harbor to be repaired. So they come in with guns blaring and they do their best, but Mother Nature tests both the British and the French Navy at that point. So here's just some stamps on the French alliance. And then Rochambeau, who is the leader of this force that's coming in, he's going to meet with George Washington at Mount Vernon. They're going to formulate a plan of action. So not only does the French alliance mean that soldiers are coming, but silver is coming. And so the French soldiers are coming with money. Their captains are coming with money. And this is great for the colonists. Because remember, many of the colonists fought against the French on the side of the British. So some of them don't trust the French. And so the French have been told quite a few times in briefings that they will be cordial, they will be polite. When they set up their camp and they leave their camp after being in camp for a while, they're going to leave it neat. They will invite people for entertainment in the evening. The French bands will play music. They try to show that they are truly on the side of the colonists. They're not just there for the battle. And they're bringing money to spend. So lots of times an invading army will simply take what they want from the local people in a village. The French coming with money are going to buy the supplies that they need. And so this quickly helps to turn the colonists onto the side of the French and welcome them a little bit more. As we get into the later part of the war, they're definitely appreciated, well liked. But in the beginning, there are some tensions. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Southern campaign. And this we have to look at, turn to South Carolina. All right, so we have South Carolina, and we're looking at the port city of Charleston. So there's two battles of Charleston that we'll talk about. The first one is disastrous. This is a total win by the British Army. In fact, if you look in the very left top corner, you see the South Carolina flag being torn down. You see a gentleman climbing up the flagpole and taking the flag down. This was the siege on Charleston. Almost 6,000 casualties. Okay, look at the numbers. 5,500 of them were American. This is a terrible, terrible loss. So General Howe, who had won at Saratoga, was over that Southern campaign. After this Battle of Charleston, General Washington changes his generals and brings in Nathanael Greene. Nathanael Greene decides to split the Continental Army in the Southern Theater. He's going to have two groups fighting because he says there are enough local militia to help support them, and it will also divide the forces of the British. They're used to fighting as one big force, and this way we can fight in smaller towns across more of the South and hopefully push them out. Now, one of the reasons that the fighting in South Carolina was so hard, and the Carolinas was so hard, is because the British had made an offer, and this was throughout the colonies, that all enslaved people were welcome to come join the British and fight on the side of the British. And if you fought for a year on the side of the British, you would be guaranteed your freedom. And they were true to their word on that. We'll talk about that at the end. And so a lot of the plantation owners would find themselves fighting against their former slaves. Now, for the most part, they formed their own units. They were not usually, it was more segregated, that you had your traditional British units and then you had your former enslaved units that were fighting. There were also some of that going on within the Continental Army. In Rhode Island, in the very beginning, they offered any enslaved person their freedom if they signed up and fought for a year with the Continental Army, and many did. Many of them were with Washington crossing the Delaware. In different places, this would go on, is that they would allow some enslaved people to join up. It just depended on the area and the time during the Revolution. All right, next battle. So there's a lot going on in the Carolinas. We have that big loss in the port city of Charleston. A major victory is a victory at Kings Mountain. And this is a turning point and an interesting battle for several reasons. And if you look, it's almost 10-1 as far as the casualties on the side of the British. But this was not the British Army. These were British loyalists, British colonists who were being fought upon. And they were led by Tarleton. And a terrible battle. And in fact, really part of the blame goes to King George and the government, because they would not supply the British loyal colonists with the weapons that they needed to fight against the Continentals. So part of that goes back to the crown. Whereas these are going to be called the Over Mountain Men. The Continental militia who are fighting are known as the Over Mountain Men. In fact, there's an Over Mountain trail that you can follow and look up to see how far these men walked from Tennessee, Kentucky, west over the Appalachians. And this is going to be way far away from the coast. This is more towards the Appalachian Mountains. A lot of fighting in that area. Another battle is Cowpens, South Carolina. This is going to be in January of 1781. So very cold time when they're typically not fighting, right? Even in South Carolina, you're going to have freezing temperatures, below zero temperatures. And so you see, again, huge victory here for the Continentals, led by Daniel Morgan, who's very well known in the Carolinas for the work that he did in leading his troops to victory there. And this is a replica. This is at Cowpens National Park. And this was a grasshopper. Grasshopper is a small light cannon. And the British had this grasshopper cannon. And that was one of the goals of Daniel Morgan, was to get the cannon from the British. All right, so these are all memorialized here with these stamps. And then Nathanael Greene, Greene with an E. Right. Next person we're going to talk about as part of the Southern campaign is Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. This is a painting of him crossing the PD River. It reminds me very much of Washington crossing the Delaware, except it's not a blizzard and it doesn't seem to be the chaos that we think of. But so in this part of the Carolinas, there are a lot of swamps, which most people don't want to go into because of the wildlife, like the alligators that are in there. And so Francis Marion, you can see again, these men are not in uniform. These look like a ragtag bunch. And he was well known for sneaking up on people and attacking them. He wasn't leading his troops across a field to fight directly with the British in uniform. That was not his style. His style is what's known as guerrilla warfare. And the word guerre means war. And it's a type of fighting where you surprise your enemy. Some people would consider it terrorist or unfair surprise attacks. And Francis Marion used guerrilla warfare by sneaking and surprising the British forces. So if we just look at this map of South Carolina and North Carolina, and I'm going to start up in the very top, we have Fayetteville. Now, Fayetteville is named after Lafayette, and Lafayette is going to become George Washington's right-hand man. He's a young man of 17. He's a French nobleman who volunteers against the French king's orders. In fact, he gets in trouble when he goes back to France, trying to get more people to come over to help. He gets reprimanded severely by the king for joining and fighting on the side of the Continentals. This is before the Battle of Saratoga even. But there's quite a few cities in the areas that were the 13 colonies named after Lafayette. Becomes like a son to George Washington. And Fayetteville in North Carolina is one of those named after Lafayette. Okay, then next we have Marion there in South Carolina near the coast, and that is named after Francis Marion. This is the area that he was running up and down with. There's a Francis Marion College. The South Carolina University mascot comes from Francis Marion, who is known to wear a big rooster feather in his cap to be able to stand out. And so he's well known there. And then you see that Marion, the town of Marion, runs along the PD River, and the PD River is what we saw that those flat bottom rafts, Francis Marion was used to go along the PD to come along and surprise the British troops. And then as we come along, we see Monroe right below the arrow. And Monroe is going to be named after, becomes President Monroe, who also fought in the American Revolution. And then if we go around by the tail of the arrow, we see Morganton. And Morganton, North Carolina, there's a Morgan Square in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Those are areas named after Daniel Morgan. And he's the one who led the attack at Cowpens and later Kings Mountain. So Monroe is about where Kings Mountain is, and between Spartanburg and Gaffney on South Carolina is where Cowpens is. And so you see that's the Over Mountain Trail will take you up and through and into that area. All right, so if we're to review, right, we started off in 1775 with a shot heard around the world and the local militia, the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere in Massachusetts. Then we have the Second Continental Congress that meets. They create an army. They name George Washington as commander-in-chief. We have quickly followed by the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is a British win. So we go into 1780. As we go into 1780, we definitely see the use of having Native Americans aiding the British, especially along the Ohio River Valley, where, again, George Clark is the one who stands out as leading battles in that area. And then the French arrive in 1780, led by Rochambeau, bringing in naval ships, 7,000 soldiers, silver and soldiers is what the French are bringing, right? And he's going to form strategies along with Nathanael Greene in the South. We're going to have Rochambeau meeting with George Washington, and they're going to have a plan of attack to try to finish out the war. All right, and we have to talk about what was happening in the North, right? We had the Battle of Trenton in 1776 at Christmas time, just end of December, the Battle of Saratoga, and then Valley Forge. So everything leads into something else. And again, we could talk for hours about many of the small battles that were not small for the people of the village. They were not small for the hundreds or thousands of men that were involved. But what it is it didn't change the war. It just continued the war. And that's why we're just not talking about